In the middle of a night of heavy rain, Ethan trembled in front of the intricately carved iron gate of the lavish villa. The rain was pouring down, and water from her wet hair flowed down her smudged face. He tried to knock on the door, and every time his small arm was raised, the cold rain water hit his flesh, making him shudder. His voice was weak, hesitating through the speaker system. Please let me stand under the eaves. I don't have a home. It's raining too hard. The light from the living room shines through the glass door frame, illuminating the image of the slender and lonely boy under the dense night. In the mansion, Mr. Richard, the silver-haired man, his eyes contemplatively behind his gold-rimmed glasses, stopped the book in his hand when he heard the voice. After a moment's hesitation, he tapped the precious wooden stick lightly on the stone floor, and said in a deep but decisive voice, "Let the boy in. Don't let it freeze to death out there." The command came out, causing the room to fall into silence. The servant was momentarily surprised, but did not dare to argue. The large gate slowly opened. Ethan walked slowly into the courtyard, his bare feet covered in mud, his arms wrapped around him in an attempt to find some warmth. When he stopped in front of the large window, his watery eyes flashed with a glint of pleading. At that moment Mr. Richard looked out. They met through the glass, and his heart suddenly shrank with the weakness and coldness emanating from the image. He lowered the cane, opened the door, and said softly, "Come here, boy." Ethan walked slowly into the living room, water dripping from his shirt in streaks on the polished marble floor. The warm and luxurious room overwhelmed him. Awkward eyes swept over the oil paintings on the walls. The chandeliers sparkled like crystals on the ceiling. Just as he was about to sit down, a servant was about to stop him for fear of dirtying the floor, but Mr. Richard raised his hand, his eyes stern but sympathetic. "Enough. Let me talk." Richard sat down across from Ethan, watching the boy from head to toe. His clothes were soaked, his limbs were pale, and his eyes were filled with fear and loneliness. "What's your name? Why are you wandering around in the middle of the night like this?" His voice was deep but warm, far from his stern appearance. Ethan crouched, his small hands clenched tightly to keep his composure. His name is Ethan. My mother told me to go make money and come back, but my mother never came back. I am lost. I don't know where my grandfather is. I'm afraid." The sentence was interrupted by choking, but those simple words were enough to silence Mr. Richard. Sour sorrow crept into his heart when he saw the poor lonely boy. After a while, Ethan raised his eyes. His gaze stopped on the large painting hanging in the middle of the room. The woman in the painting with a gentle smile made him unconsciously exclaim, his voice trembling, "Mom, my mother." Words like lightning fell on Mr. Richard. His whole body stopped. His eyes full of astonishment turned to Ethan. "Hey, what did you just say?" His voice trembled, his heart pounding as if he didn't want to believe what he had just heard. Ethan raised his head to look at him. His eyes were both sincere and fragile. My mother said that she would take me to see my grandfather. That's my mother in the picture." Stunned, Richard felt everything around him collapse for a moment. That picture, Linnea, his only daughter. The person he cut off contact with after a heartbreaking argument. Now, in front of him was a boy who had accepted her as a mother, and his words were like a needle piercing his heart, which was already full of torment. The space in the living room seemed to freeze. Only the ticking sound of the wall clock and the sound of rain outside echoed in. Richard's eyes were red, and his thin fingers trembled and touched Ethan's arm as if to make sure he wasn't an illusion. "Linnea, my daughter," he muttered, his gaze sliding towards the painting with immense pain. "My daughter. Linnea, where is she?" Ethan lowered his head, biting his lower lip tightly. His small hands clenched. After a long time he whispered, his voice choked as if breaking every word, "Mom, my mother told me to go find him. My mother will come later. Now I'm alone." Words like a hammer fell on Mr. Richard. He stood motionless, His heart clenched in indescribable pain. The image of Linnea in his memory flashed like a torrent. His daughter's smile, her voice calling Daddy every time. He had lost her, but never thought that he would lose her forever. Regret gnaws as he remembers the last time he kicked Linnea out of the house, refusing to forgive her for her decision. His voice was completely lost, and his old eyes sparkled. I was wrong. I didn't have time to atone for my mistakes. Ethan, though he did not fully understand what was going on, could clearly feel the pain in Mr. Richards' eyes. He hesitated to approach, pulled his sleeve lightly, and whispered weakly, "Grandpa, my mother told me that he was a good person. I don't blame you. My mother told me to go find my grandfather to have a family, so that I wouldn't be lonely anymore." Those words pierced Mr. Richards' heart. He burst into tears, something he had not allowed himself to do for a long time. Unconsciously, he put his arms around Ethan tightly in his arms. The warm feeling of the thin boy soothed his heart somewhat, but it also made the torment deeper. I was wrong, Ethan. I was wrong too much. But from now on, I won't let you be lonely anymore. He choked up, squeezing the boy tighter, as if he was afraid that as soon as he loosened his hand, he would disappear like a dream. Richard sat in his library, holding an old photograph of Linnea in his hand. Under the pale yellow light, his daughter's bright smile seemed to be still alive, shining in her intelligent, sparkling eyes. He turned the photo over, on which was a brief handwritten inscription, "For Father Linnea." His shoulders shook slightly. "I never told you much about my mother." He turned to Ethan, who was sitting curled up in an armchair by the fireplace. "Do you keep anything from your mother? A letter, a diary? Or anything about your life after you left home?" Ethan lowered his head in thought, then nodded slowly. He pulled out a small notebook from the frayed backpack next to him. The notebook is simple. The leather cover has peeled off and is variegated with timestamps. He placed it in Richard's hand with a little reserved look. "This is my mother's diary. Mom always carries and records everything. I kept it because my mother said it was precious." Mr. Richard turned the first pages, and Linnea's soft handwriting appeared, sometimes excited, sometimes sad. He read every word. His heart seemed to get lost among the memories of his daughter whom he had been separated from for so long.
My dear father, I think a lot about you today. I know you don't agree with my decision, but I believe I did the right thing. Ethan is the light in my life, but every time I look at him, I think of him. How are you doing? Do you think about me? I hope that one day you will understand me.
Those words of love made Mr. Richards' heart heavy. He continued to read, seeing Linnea's difficulties in life, the hard work, the days of battling illness, and above all, her love for Ethan and him. But what caught his attention most were the notes about a small house in the suburbs where Linnea had lived before she died. The address is clearly stated. "Perhaps that place will answer me all," he whispered. Richard looked up at Ethan, determination burning in his eyes. "Ethan, we're going to this place." He wanted to learn all about his mother and grandchildren, and also want to find a way to atone for the lost years. Ethan was silent, looking at him with hopeful eyes. He didn't say anything, but his little pursed lips trembled again, as if he wanted to secretly thank the grandfather he never thought he would have. In that moment, between the tear-stained diary and the belated love, both people seemed to have found a piece of their family in their journey to trace the past. The bus took Richard and Ethan along the deserted roads to the suburb where Linnea had lived. The house is located in the middle of a small tree-lined street, quietly as if hiding secrets from the past. The tiny house was painted white, with an old eaves and withered flower pots lined up next to dusty windows. Ethan stood in front of the door, his heart pounding. He had heard his mother mention this place many times, but this was the first time he had seen it. Meanwhile, Mr. Richard watched intently around, his eyes sharp as if he was looking for some hidden memory. The door does not lock. The two stepped inside, The space was filled with the smell of old wood and dust. A feeling that was both familiar and strange rushed in, as if Linnea's soul was still here. Ethan carefully walked through every corner of the room, his eyes scanning the remaining memorabilia. A hand-embroidered pillow on the sofa, a small photograph of him as a child, a wooden music box on the table. "Is this?" Ethan whispered, pointing to the music box. Mr. Richard nodded, slowly picking up the box. It was a gift he gave Linnea for her 12th birthday, when she was a naughty but affectionate little girl. He opened the box, and a familiar melody sounded, filling the empty room. The music made Mr. Richard stop, as if time had stopped. Ethan continued to search, and at the corner table, he found an old sealed envelope, with a brief inscription written on the outside of the cover. "For Dad and Ethan." His hands trembled as he held the letter. He looked at Mr. Richard, his eyes questioning. "Open it," he said, his voice deep, as if sensing the importance of the letter. Ethan carefully unwrapped the envelope, pulling out a faded piece of paper. His voice choked up as he read.
"Dear Dad, my little Ethan, I am writing this letter because I know that my time is running out. She fought hard to give Ethan a full life, but now she understands that she can't do it alone. Ethan needs a family. He needs to know that he is never alone in the world. Father, I have never blamed you for not understanding me when I chose this life. On the contrary, I wish I could see in Ethan a part of me, a reason for me to forgive the past. Love him as I once loved you. I love you. And Ethan, you are the light of my life."
Ethan's voice choked up. His hands clenched into the letter. Mr. Richard bowed his head, tears quietly falling on his face, deep in the wrinkles of time. The room fell silent, only the ticking sound of the clock on the wall remaining, as if reminding that the past could not be changed, but the present was still to be corrected. "We'll take care of each other, Ethan," he said, his eyes steadfast. "You won't leave me alone anymore." Ethan didn't answer, but he walked over and hugged him tightly. For the first time in his life, he felt a real warmth like his mother's arms, but this time, it was from a grandfather he had always longed for. As the sun went down, both Richard and Ethan decided to leave Linnea's house. They collected what was left, a music box, a letter, and a few other small items that they both thought were meaningful. Stepping outside, the cool evening air seemed to make their mood more relieved. But this peace did not last long. As soon as they walked to the car, a black shadow suddenly appeared from the corner of the road. A tall man with a stealthy appearance walked towards them. In his hand was a metal stick, shining under the dim street light. "You're Richard Vaughan, aren't you?" His voice was hoarse, mixed with a clear threat. Richard frowned slightly, blocking Ethan behind his back. "Yes. But who are you, and why do you want to see me?" The man smirked sinisterly. "You must know who Linnea has troubled in her life. And now, the two of you have come here again. You must want to rekindle everything." Mr. Richard replied coldly. "If Linnea has ever been in trouble, it's a thing of the past. Now that we're here to find out the truth, there's no reason for you to interfere." The man burst out laughing. "Truth? Do you really think that the truth will bring anything good? I advise the two of you to turn around and forget about everything. Otherwise, there won't be a good ending." Before Mr. Richard could reply, the man rushed toward them. Ethan screamed when he saw Richard try to push him aside. But Richard was no longer healthy enough to resist the sudden attack. The swing of the stick staggered him, but he kept it, shielding Ethan. "Run, Ethan. Hurry up," Richard shouted. Ethan stepped back, but he couldn't let his grandfather face danger alone. At that moment, he suddenly remembered that in his pocket there was an old phone that his mother had left behind. He quickly dialed the number to call the police while quietly hiding behind the attacker. "Don't touch my grandfather," Ethan shouted, and with all his strength, he grabbed a nearby tree branch and slammed it into the man's back. He screamed in pain, lost his balance, and dropped the stick to the ground. Richard rushed over quickly, trying to hold on to the club, while Ethan stood next to him, ready to defend. The two worked together unexpectedly, and finally, when the police car horn sounded in the distance, the man was forced to flee, disappearing into the darkness. The police arrived in time and recorded the incident. A police officer promised to investigate, but Richard knew that this was not simply a street attacker. "Ethan," said Mr. Richard, placing his hand on his shoulder. "He knows my mother and knows me. This is bigger than I thought." Ethan swallowed dryly, his eyes worried but steadfast. "We're not going to stop, sir. She never gives up, and neither do we." Mr. Richard nodded. Although danger awaits ahead, they know that they have gone too far to turn back. Linnea deserves the truth, and no one can stop them from finding it. The next morning, Richard and Ethan decided to go to the charity hospital where Linnea had worked. It was an old building in the suburbs, with walls that had faded over the years. Inside, the air was quiet, only the sound of the footsteps of nurses and patients walking quietly in the corridor. When he arrived at the front desk, Mr. Richard politely asked the clerk, "Hello, I'm Richard Vaughn. A relative of mine, Linnea Vaughn, used to work here. I hope to be able to talk to someone who knows about her." The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with her hair in a neat bun, hesitated for a moment before answering. "Linnea? This name sounds familiar. But she's been out of work here for a long time. Let me check it out a bit." She flipped through the pages of the old register, her eyes narrowing every time she found an important detail. Finally, she stopped. "Here it is. Linnea Vaughn used to work here more than 10 years ago, but suddenly she disappeared. Before leaving, she often talks about a patient named Sylvia Scott, who lives at a nearby nursing home. It seems that the two of you are very close. Is there anyone else who has worked with her that we can contact?" asked Mr. Richard, in a voice tinged with a hint of worry. "Only Dr. Nathan Briggs. But he has also retired a long time ago. Still, he may still live in a small house a few blocks away." Leaving the front desk, Richard and Ethan decided to go find the nursing home where Sylvia Scott was staying. But the tense atmosphere in the hospital bothered Ethan. In the corridor they walked through, everything seemed to hide an unsolved mystery. While passing by an old room, Ethan's eyes were drawn by a door with a sign that said Archives. Intuition urged him to step closer. You gently tugged at Mr. Richard's sleeve. "Grandpa, I think we should take a look at your file here. Maybe there's something they didn't mention." Mr. Richard nodded, but when he was about to open the door, a security guard appeared with a stern look. "Sorry, this area is for employees only." Ethan tried to stay calm, his eyes looking at Mr. Richard beckoning. Mr. Richard smiled and walked over to the security guard. "I just want to review some records about my family. This is very important. If there is a problem, I will talk to the hospital manager." The guard seemed uncomfortable, but finally reluctantly opened the door. In the dimly lit little room, filing cabinets were stacked in long rows, carrying with them the smell of old paper and the dust of time. Ethan began to rummage through the cabinets in alphabetical order. After searching for a while, he pulled out a file with the name Linnea Vaughn. But when they opened it, they couldn't help but be surprised. The file only had a few lines of notes about her work and working days. The last part strangely reads, "Stop working, reason unknown." However, when flipping the backside, a loose piece of paper dropped. It was a short letter with hasty handwriting.
"If anyone can read it, I beg you to go to the Windridge nursing home to find Sylvia Scott. The truth about my life lies there. Father, I have never blamed you for not understanding me when I chose this life. On the contrary, I wish I could see in Ethan a part of me, a reason for me to forgive the past. Love him as I once loved you. I love you. And Ethan, you are the light of my life."
The two looked at each other, and there was consistency in their eyes. This clue not only made them more determined, but also confirmed that the last place they had to go was a nursing home. But will they be able to find the answers they want, or will they just encounter more mysteries? The drizzle began to fall when Richard and Ethan arrived at the Windridge nursing home. It's an old but well-preserved building, with a small garden dotted with wooden benches. The gentle singing of birds blended with the peaceful atmosphere of this place, but Mr. Richard's heart was full of emotions. They were led into the room of Sylvia Scott, an elderly woman with grey hair and gentle but melancholy eyes. When she heard the mention of Linnea's name, she raised her head, her eyes lit up for a moment and then became wet. Linnea. Oh my gosh, someone finally asked about her. Linnea is an angel. But I know she's suffered too much, Sylvia whispered, her voice trembling. Richard took her by the hand and asked emotionally, Mrs. Sylvia, please tell us. Linnea. What did he ever say to her? What's causing her to leave? Mrs. Sylvia nodded slightly, her eyes distant as if she was returning to the memory of the year. She said slowly, Linnea comes here often to visit me. She not only takes care but also talks like a soulmate. But the more I talked, the more I realized that she was carrying a pain. Linnea once mentioned that her father was a rich and powerful man, but he was unaware of her presence. Every time she mentions this, she sheds tears. Sylvia's words made Richard's heart tighten. A sense of guilt surged when he realized that the girl he had coldly turned away from was Linnea. The dire situation at that time made him choose to stay away. But now, things are too late to correct. But that's not all, Sylvia said, interrupting his line of thought. Linnea once talked about a child. She gave birth to a baby but couldn't raise it because the circumstances were too difficult. After that, Linnea left here, but before leaving, she left me a small box. She stood up slowly, took out a small velvet-wrapped box from the old wooden cabinet, and handed it to Mr. Richard and Ethan. Inside is a silver necklace with a heart engraved with Ethan's name. Ethan! Richard exclaimed, tears rolling down his cheeks. He turned to look at his nephew, his heart filled with regret and love for Linnea. The daughter he had never been brave enough to love left him with a gift that was more precious than life. Ethan gripped the necklace tightly in his hand, his eyes gloomy but steadfast. My mother has sacrificed a lot for me. But I believe she is still somewhere, waiting for us to find her. Mr. Richard looked deeply into Ethan's eyes, his heart full of determination. I was wrong with your mother, but from now on I will not leave anyone in my family alone. Let's keep searching, Ethan. Linnea deserves all the love I haven't had time for her. The two left the nursing home, carrying not only the box but a promise. No matter how difficult it was, they would continue to search, not only to see Linnea again, but also to heal the wounds of an entire family. On the way back from the nursing home, Richard's heart was filled with mixed emotions. The scenery outside faded under the rain glass, and his mind was focused on Linnea's silhouette. In the box handed over by Mrs. Sylvia, in addition to the necklace, was a handwritten letter. Linnea's soft but decisive handwriting made him both sad and choked.
Dear Father, if you read this letter, it is certain that we will no longer be on the same path. I don't blame you for anything. Since I was a child, I have always longed for the day to be hugged by my father, saying that I am proud of you. But I understand that, sometimes, love is not always expressed in action. I just hope that one day, if you remember me, love, Ethan. You are all the most beautiful thing in my life. I love you, Linnea.
The last words made Mr. Richard unable to hold back his tears. It was not only Linnea's goodbye, but also a painful reminder of the years he missed the opportunity to fulfill his responsibilities as a father. Ethan, are you okay? He asked when he saw the boy staring out the window. I'm fine. But I still don't understand why my mother left without trying to contact her family, Ethan replied, her eyes shining with determination. I think we have to go back to where you started everything. It could be where she left the past behind or where she hoped to start a new future. In response to Ethan's words, Richard felt a glimmer of hope. They decided to start in the poor neighborhoods where Linnea had lived for years. The first trace led them to the home of a middle-aged woman, Rosa, the owner of the inn where Linnea had rented a room. Rosa looked at them in surprise, but after hearing the story, her eyes softened. Linnea is a good person. She used to do two things at once to support her son. But last year she began to get seriously ill, getting weaker and weaker. Linnea sold everything she had to try to heal. She mentioned having to go far to find help. Mr. Richard asked in a low voice, "Do you know where she went? Any clues can help us." Rosa hesitated before saying, "The last time I heard, Linnea talked about a charity hospital in the suburbs. But she didn't say her name. Just to mention that it is where the poor are treated with kindness. The clue is faint but the greatest hope they have." Mr. Richard, with a spirit of redemption, decided not to miss any opportunity. Ethan, with a silver necklace in his hand, constantly encouraged his grandfather. The next journey will not be easy, but with each step, Mr. Richard feels that the regret in his heart is gradually being replaced by love and determination. They are not only looking for Linnea, but they are also finding their own heart, something that has been lost for years. After days of searching, Richard and Ethan finally arrived at the charity hospital located in the middle of a peaceful valley. The hospital looks old but warm, with confetti trellises surrounding the window frames. The feeling of silence here is strange. Not sadness but a form of peace that makes people feel their hearts soften. They were led into the administrative area by an elderly nurse. In the archives, the woman found Linnea's file. The hospital noted that Linnea had been here and was admitted in poor health. She stayed here through the last months of her life, living a simple but not lonely life, as she made friends with many patients and staff. Before she died, she left a letter for her family in case they came, the nurse said, then handed the letter to Mr. Richard. Mr. Richard received the letter, his hands trembling. Ethan's eyes sparkled as if waiting for a complete answer. The letter was opened, and Linnea's last words appeared before their eyes.
"Dear Dad and Ethan, if you ever read this letter, know that you have lived a meaningful life, despite the pain and loss. Here, among strangers, I have found the love I thought I would never have the opportunity to receive. But it wasn't my father's fault or anyone else's. Sometimes, life takes us to places that seem unbearable, but it's an opportunity to find our true inner strength. Father, I have forgiven everything that happened in the past. My life is full of difficulties. I understand that. But Father, what I want most is not redemption but for me and Ethan to live a full life. Let's love and cherish each other. Don't let suffering stop you from coming together. Life is short, but love and compassion are immortal. With all love, Linnea. **.
Reading this, Mr. Richard couldn't hold back his tears. Ethan also cried, but in his eyes, the suffering had been replaced by a strong belief in the power of family and love. They stood quietly, the sunset gently falling on the hospital. At this time, Mr. Richard realized that atonement is not only about doing the right thing to make up for mistakes, but also about changing the way he loves and lives. When he walked out of the hospital, Mr. Richard held Ethan's hand, clearly feeling the warmth from his relatives for the first time. They didn't say anything, but in their hearts they both understood that their journey was not only to find Linnea, but also to find themselves in love and forgiveness. The journey is over, but the messages Linnea leaves behind will live on forever. Not only in them, but in every heart brave enough to love, despite the breakdown of life.